Welcome to section 4.4, complex numbers. Now, I mentioned before in my classes that we're going to be working with complex numbers that are also known as imaginary numbers. So, to clarify, I make a distinction between invisible numbers, meaning the invisible one, and imaginary number. Because, for example, if you had just x by itself, or m by itself, or c by itself, I always say that there's an invisible 1 in front of the variable stating that there's one x, one m, and one c. And I made a big distinction because most would say that, oh, it's an imaginary 1 in front of x, imaginary 1 in front of m, imaginary 1 in front of c. I was like, no, that's not the case. I always stated that it's going to be invisible 1 because now we're in a section where we're going to be working with imaginary numbers. So, I stated before, complex is another term for imaginary. And the reason I bring the word imaginary is because we're going to be using the symbol I, which is written right here. So when you see an I in any question and any equation, then that means you're going to be dealing with complex numbers, or also known as imaginary numbers. Usually we do not use I as a variable when solving an equation because we assign I as imaginary. The first I that I wrote, the value of I is the square root of -1. So when you have I, for sure you're going to be working with complex imaginary numbers. Another way to know that you are working with imaginary complex number is when you have a negative number inside the square root, only the square root. So let me repeat. You know that you're going to be working with complex imaginary numbers when you have a negative number inside the square root, and you're going to have to simplify it so that your final answer will have a positive number inside the square root. Or if you can do the square root but just remove the negative. And you'll see some examples in 4.6 on how we're going to remove the negative. Alright, so again, the first I, the value is the square root of -1. If it's I squared, then the value is -1. I to the third, the value is -I. And then I to the fourth is +1. So be familiar with these four i's and its corresponding values, because we're going to be dealing with mainly with I and I squared. But there's some problems where you may have to work with I to the third and I to the fourth. The reason I want you to be familiar with the values is because when you're working with I squared, I to the third, or I to the fourth, it's easy to convert into these values when solving an equation or simplifying expressions versus solving and then having your answer with I squared, I to the third, and I to the fourth. So to go off on that is that in your equations, in your expression, if you have I squared, I to the third, and I to the fourth, then you must convert into these values for your final answer. So you're okay to have I in your final answer. It's just you cannot have I squared, I to the third, and I to the fourth in your final answer. So if you are trying to simplify and get your final answer, you must convert into these values here. And you're going to see some examples of what I mean by converting into these corresponding values. So we're going to start off with simplifying the square root of negative numbers. The reason we're going over this is because this will help you solve the third part in 4.6 when using quadratic formula that has negative numbers inside the square root. So in our first example, we have the square root of -16. When you have something like that, what I want you to do is break it down to two numbers that can get you -16. In this case, it will be -1 times 16. And I'm going to employ or use the same process I did in 4.6a and 4.6b. I'm going to break this into two square root since it's multiplying. So this, the square root of -1 is just I, and then the square root of 16 will be 4. Now, the reason I put -1 first is because sometimes when you cannot find the square root of a perfect square number, so meaning if you don't have a perfect square number, you might have something like I the square root of 3 and I the square root of 2. So with these type of examples, we're going to put the I in front of the square root and the square root of the numbers go behind. So in this case though, it's going to be different. Since it's I times 4, it's just like a variable, x times 4, your final answer here is 4I. So that's only if you can do the square root of the number. So this is the final answer, 4I, for square root of -16. Now, then the second example, I'm going to employ the same process. So two numbers that give you -25, meaning -1 times +25. So I'm going to break it down to two square roots. So square root of -1 times the square root of 25. The square root of -1, that will become I. And then the square root of 25, you can actually do that. That would become 5. So I times 5 will be 5I. And that will be my final answer. So these two examples, they have perfect square numbers, 16 and 25. Next, we're going to be working with non-perfect square numbers. So in the next example, we have the square root of -20. So 20 is not a perfect square number. That means we're going to actually have to break it into two numbers that give you 20, but also another number to make it negative. So first off, since it's -20, I'm going to factor out the -1, so -1 right here, times 20. And then since it's multiplying, I can actually split this into two square roots. So the square root of -1 times the square root of 20. Now for the 20, I can break that down into two numbers, which is 4 and 5. So I'm actually going to have three square roots. So the square root of -1 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. So the only ones that I can simplify is the square root of -1 is I, the square root of 4 is 2, and I cannot do the square root of 5, so it stays the same. So I times 2 times square root of 5 will be 2I square root of 5. Just like that. And this is your final answer when you were to simplify square root of -20. Now I'm going to employ the same process with square root of -72. So I'm going to factor out the -1 first. Next, I'm going to break it down to two square roots, so square root of -1, square root of 72. Alright, now 72, I can break that down into two more numbers. So square root of -1 times 36 times 2. So it will be square root of -1 times square root of 36 times square root of 2. So square root of -1, that would become I, times the square root of 36 will be 6 times square root of 2. I can't do that, so it stays the same. So now we have I times 6 times square root of 2. That would be 6I square root of 2. And that would be my final answer when simplifying with a negative number inside the square root.